Welcome, dear listeners. Before we dive into today's journey, just a quick glimpse of what is to come. A tale of resilience, the harsh reality of earning one's place, and a love that demands everything a person has to give, set against the unforgiving backdrop of the frontier. If you enjoy this type of content, do not forget to subscribe to our channel Wildwood Hearts. We post videos every day, so please leave a like on this video if you enjoy the story, and drop a comment letting us know where you are from and what time you are listening to us. Wyoming, 1882. Julian Vance had faced a great multitude of formidable challenges throughout the span of his 22 years of life. He had confronted a wild horse that threw him violently to the cold ground 3 separate times, before he finally managed to find his balance and stay securely on its back. He had endured the bitter, freezing conditions of a Wyoming winter completely alone in an isolated line shack, surviving the harshest months with absolutely nothing to his name except a meager supply of dried beans and his own sheer, unyielding stubbornness. Furthermore, he had faced the sheer terror of a massive cattle stampede when he was only 16 years old. A harrowing and violent event that had permanently left him with a thick visible scar running down his left forearm, along with a chaotic story that he still recounted rather poorly to anyone who asked. However, absolutely none of those past trials and intense tribulations had adequately prepared him for the daunting, terrifying task of standing on the front porch of the sprawling Brooks Ranch. He found himself standing motionless at the wooden gate on a crisp Thursday morning in the brisk month of October, holding his worn, dusty hat nervously in his calloused hands, while his racing heart did something entirely unreasonable and erratic inside his chest. He found himself staring intently at the large farmhouse where the formidable Arthur Brooks was, almost certainly residing inside, and for a fleeting, desperate moment, the young man seriously thought about just turning around and walking away. In fact, he had actively thought about turning around and walking away from this exact property every single day for the past 3 consecutive months. Arthur Brooks was a highly intimidating figure, being 55 years old and standing 6 feet and 2 inches tall, a quintessential hardened Wyoming rancher who possessed a thick beard that had gone prematurely gray before its time. He had piercing eyes that carried the distinct heavy quality of a man who has witnessed enough of the harsh world to know exactly what he is looking at whenever he casts his stern gaze upon a person or a problem. He was precisely the kind of uncompromising man that other working men in the county described simply as fair. What those men genuinely meant was that he was fair in the exact same way that the weather is fair, consistently, entirely without soft sentiment and completely without any interest whatsoever in what you personally thought about his decisions. Julian Vance, on the other hand, was a mere 22 years old and possessed very little in the way of worldly wealth or established reputation. His material possessions were exceedingly meager, consisting entirely of a dependable horse, a worn leather saddle, a sturdy length of rope, and approximately $14 to his name. He earned his modest living by working for daily wages on the large Carmichael operation located roughly 6 miles to the east. It was a demanding job which paid him decently enough for the backbreaking seasonal work he provided, but which unfortunately paid him absolutely nothing at all during the long, freezing winter months. By any reasonable measurement or standard of civilized society, he was undeniably far too poor to ever be considered a suitable match for Arthur Brooks's beloved daughter, and he was painfully, constantly aware of this inescapable fact. He had known this harsh reality for the entire duration of the 3 long months that he had been actively trying, and completely failing, not to fall deeply and helplessly in love with Hazel Brooks. His desperate attempts to resist his growing feelings for her had been approximately as successful as a foolish man trying to forcefully not notice the bright sun rising in the eastern sky. Eventually, he gathered his remaining courage, opened the creaking wooden gate, and steadily walked up to the sturdy porch. He knocked firmly on the heavy door, and when Arthur Brooks finally opened it and looked down at him with those intense fair-weather eyes, Julian Vance took a deep breath and proceeded to say the absolute truest and most terrifying thing he had ever spoken to another human being in his entire life. He looked the imposing older man squarely in the eye and said, "Mr. Brooks, I would very much like to speak with you regarding Hazel." The entire complicated situation had originally started precisely how most significant and life-altering things in Julian's life seemed to start. which was with the demanding labor of fixing a broken fence. Specifically, the issue had intimately involved the crucial boundary fence line that strictly divided the property between the Carmichael operation and the Brooks Ranch. This particular geographical boundary had a notoriously weak section located near the water that reliably came down every single spring season, without fail, whenever the nearby creek flooded its muddy banks. During the wet spring of 1882, this problematic section of the wooden fence had specifically come down on the Carmichael side of the dividing property line. Technically speaking, this specific detail made the broken fence entirely Carmichael's immediate problem to solve, which consequently meant that Julian was the unfortunate ranch hand assigned to the strenuous task of fixing it. He had been out there working diligently by the water for 2 solid hours on a crisp May morning, forcefully driving heavy wooden posts deep into the cold ground that was still somewhat soft and muddy from the recent winter snow melt. It was during this strenuous, repetitive labor that he suddenly heard the distinct sound of someone moving around on the opposite side of the brush along the fence line. He stopped his heavy work, wiped the sweat from his brow, and looked up to see who was there. Hazel Brooks was 19 years old, possessing beautiful, dark, wavy hair that she practically kept tied back in a loose, functional braid to keep it out of her face while she worked. She also possessed the specific, unmistakable directness of a confident person who had grown up fully knowing exactly where everything was located on a working ranch and precisely how all of those things functioned. She was out there independently checking the Brooks side of the long fence line, focusing specifically on the section on her side of the creek, which was also severely damaged and completely down. This meant that she was voluntarily out there doing her father's heavy fence work early on a Saturday morning, without ever being asked or expected to do so, a striking detail which Julian immediately and quietly noted with immense respect. Upon noticing him working in the mud, she immediately called out across the water, "Carmichael side?" utilizing the blunt question as her own straightforward way of offering a morning greeting. He paused his hammering, simply replied, "Yes," and then she quickly informed him that they were also down on their side of the creek. She then proceeded to look over the extensive damage to the wooden rails with the sharp, assessing eye of an experienced hand who has clearly repaired many broken fences before. She confidently stated that a specific supporting post had been soft and rotting since the previous fall season, and that her papa had kept repeatedly saying he would eventually get around to fixing it, but hadn't yet. Seeing a perfect opportunity to be helpful and perhaps spend more time near her, Julian quickly offered that he could just do her side of the fence as well, simply stating that he might as well since he was already out there working anyway. She looked back across the boundary at him with a complex, thoughtful expression that he could not quite read or fully understand, firmly telling him that he certainly did not have to do her heavy work for her. He gently insisted, replying that he knew. He didn't have to but wanted to help. True to his offered word, he diligently fixed the Carmichael side of the boundary first, ensuring the posts were deep and secure, and then he immediately crossed over the creek and efficiently fixed the Brooks side of the boundary as well. As a gesture of gratitude for his unsolicited help, she thoughtfully brought him some fresh, cool water halfway through his strenuous labor, a kindness which he gratefully accepted. They ended up pausing their respective chores and talked comfortably for 20 minutes straight about the broken fence, the recent creek flood, the general state of the Carmichael cattle herd, and whether the spring season seemed to be arriving early or late that particular year. And when he finally mounted his horse and rode back to the bunkhouse later that evening, he was fully aware that he was already in deep trouble regarding his heart, and he knew it with absolute, terrifying certainty. Following that fateful morning by the flooded creek, he managed to see her 4 more distinct times before the warm month of June arrived, though these brief encounters were always from some distance away across the fields, and were always heartbreakingly brief. Each time they crossed paths and briefly exchanged glances, he rode away from her feeling exactly like a foolish man who had been standing much too close to a raging hot fire, and had stubbornly chosen not to move away, when he clearly should have. By the time July finally rolled around, he had completely stopped pretending to himself that this intense feeling was going to magically resolve itself without his direct and active involvement in the matter. Meanwhile, Martha Brooks had been happily and successfully married to Arthur for 28 long, eventful years. Over the course of those nearly 3 decades of frontier life, she had expertly developed the highly specific and immensely useful skill of seeing important things that her husband was inevitably going to need a full 3 weeks to finally arrive at and realize on his own. She vividly saw Julian Vance the very first time he ever came onto the actual Brooks property. He was not there to officially speak to Arthur, at least not yet, as he had not gathered the courage for that confrontation. He was merely passing through the sprawling land on a routine errand for the Carmichael operation that just so happened to bring him within a very close conversational distance of the front porch, where Hazel was quietly sitting in a chair and shelling fresh peas into a bowl. Martha stood silently out of sight and watched the entire polite interaction unfold from the clear vantage point of her kitchen window. She carefully watched the young man politely take his dusty hat completely off his head when he stopped his horse to speak to Hazel. She watched him intently listen whenever Hazel spoke, noticing specifically that he actually listened to her words rather than merely waiting for his own turn to speak. She watched him laugh openly at something clever Hazel said, displaying the genuine, hearty laugh of a person who has been genuinely surprised into true amusement. Finally, she watched Hazel quietly watch him as he mounted his horse and slowly rode away into the distance. Later that same evening, as they all sat down together at the table for a hearty supper, Martha purposefully said absolutely nothing about the brief encounter she had witnessed from the window. Arthur was busy, talking at length about the current dry state of the North pasture and the fluctuating price of beef down in Cheyenne, while Martha politely listened to his reports and said all the appropriate things one says during a meal. Internally, however, she sat there and thought deeply about a respectful young man who took his hat off and truly listened when a woman spoke. Eventually, Arthur casually mentioned that he saw Hazel was out talking to the Carmichael hand earlier that day. Martha simply replied with a smooth, non-committal mm-hmm. Arthur elaborated on his observation, stating that it was the young fellow named Vance, he thought. Once again, Martha offered only a simple mm-hmm. Arthur paused with his fork halfway to his mouth and looked closely at his wife. In their 28 years together, he had astutely learned that Martha's simple mm-hmm actually possessed approximately 14 entirely different meanings depending on her tone. He also knew that this particular intonation definitely meant she knew something important that he didn't currently know. He bluntly asked her, "What?" To which she calmly replied, "Nothing," and smoothly asked him to pass the bread. Arthur obligingly passed the basket of bread across the table with the slightly frustrated expression of a man who acutely knows he is far behind on critical information and is entirely unsure of how to quickly catch up to his wife's intuition. Martha serenely buttered her bread with the calm, unshakable confidence of a wise woman who has already figured out exactly how this entire story is going to end, and is simply waiting patiently for everyone else in the room to finally get there. The summer months passed. October arrived with a chill, and Julian finally ran entirely out of viable reasons to wait any longer to state his intentions. He had purposefully spent the entire summer constantly finding seemingly legitimate reasons to be anywhere near the Brooks property. He offered to help with random fence repairs, asked complex questions regarding cattle health, and even went out of his way to return a rusted tool that Carmichael had allegedly borrowed from Arthur years ago, a tool that Carmichael himself actually had no memory whatsoever of borrowing. Every single time he visited on these fabricated errands, he saw Hazel. Every single time they spoke, the conversation was exceptionally good and effortless, and every single time he eventually rode away, he felt simultaneously more certain of his profound love and much more afraid of his bleak financial prospects. Back in September, before the weather fully turned, Hazel had sat and looked at him directly across the sturdy wooden surface of the Brooks kitchen table. Martha had warmly invited him inside the house for a fresh, hot cup of coffee, after he had physically helped bring in a heavy section of fencing that had unfortunately come down during a severe autumn storm. This entire scenario was something which Martha had expertly engineered with the flawless precision of a clever woman who knows exactly what she is doing and precisely how to bring two young people together. As they sat there sipping the brew, she looked at him and said, very simply and directly, that he always seemed to find a reason to come by the ranch. He weakly attempted to defend his constant presence by citing the broken fences as his primary excuse. She quickly countered his weak defense, stating clearly that the fences were perfectly fine, Julian. He nervously looked down at his warm cup of coffee, unable to hold her steady gaze. Finally, abandoning his excuses, he softly admitted, yes, and honestly confessed that he indeed always found a reason to visit her. Upon hearing his honest admission, she had simply smiled back at him with a warm, knowing expression that was definitively not a question. Consequently, he finally made his ultimate decision and arrived that fateful Thursday in October, standing there on the porch with his hat in his hands, his mere $14 to his name, and the particular overwhelming terror of a brave young man who has firmly decided to do the most honest thing possible, completely regardless of how terribly it might land. When Arthur finally answered the heavy wooden door, he simply looked down at the young man and initially said absolutely nothing at all. Julian respectfully addressed him, saying, "Mr. Brooks," and stated that he would very much like to speak with him regarding Hazel. Arthur stood in the doorway and looked at him in total silence for a very long, tense moment. Finally, he slowly stepped aside, opening the path into his home, and simply instructed the young man to come inside. They solemnly made their way into the house and sat down together at the large kitchen table. Martha quickly appeared from the stove bearing hot coffee that she had clearly already had brewed and ready to serve, a detail which heavily implied she had been fully expecting this exact visit to happen today. Julian found this maternal foresight to be simultaneously comforting and deeply alarming as he took his seat. Once seated, he spoke his piece plainly and directly, primarily because he simply didn't know how to articulate difficult things in any other convoluted way. He looked the older couple in the eyes and stated firmly that he cared deeply about Hazel. He formally requested their blessing, stating that he would very much like to court her properly, but only with their explicit permission. He then nervously averted his gaze and looked down at the wooden table. He honestly confessed that he knew full well he was far too poor for their daughter, Mr. Brooks, openly admitting that he did not possess any land, any savings, or really anything much of material value to offer her. However, he earnestly added that his only real assets were that he worked incredibly hard, that he genuinely meant everything he said, and that he would, before momentarily stopping his speech as nervous emotion caught in his throat. He quickly started again, forcefully promising that he would eagerly spend the rest of his entire life making absolutely sure that she never once regretted choosing him. After his impassioned speech, the kitchen became incredibly quiet, filled with a heavy anticipatory silence. Arthur Brooks sat silently and closely examined this earnest young man, taking in the sight of his worn, faded work shirt, his dusty hat, his calloused hands, and the metaphorical $14 that was glaringly visible in the complete and utter absence of anything else of value. Arthur maintained his silence for a long enough period that Julian's racing heart had ample time to do several more entirely unreasonable and terrified things. Finally, Arthur broke the silence and firmly stated that his daughter needed a good man, not necessarily a rich one. He paused significantly after delivering this profound statement, letting the weight of his words settle in the room. He then continued, bluntly stating that he was not going to give Julian his final answer today. He stared deeply at Julian with those cold, fair-weather eyes of his. He announced that he was going to give the young man something else first, and that they would all just have to wait and see exactly what he managed to do with it. The formidable something that Arthur subsequently gave him was an incredibly daunting task designed to push a man to his limits. He explained that the old Thornton property, located roughly 8 miles to the north, was widely considered to be the absolute hardest piece of ranching land in the entire county. He detailed how old Silas Thornton had unfortunately passed away back in August, tragically leaving the entire sprawling ranching operation to his grieving son. This son, Ethan, was only 19 years old, possessed absolutely no real management experience, and was undoubtedly going to lose the entire herd of cattle to the harsh winter if he didn't receive some serious experienced help immediately. Arthur explained that he had formally agreed to send one of his own hands to assist the overwhelmed boy. He then dropped the heavy condition. He instructed Julian that he would be the one to spend the entire harsh winter up there on that brutal land. Furthermore, Arthur explicitly stated there would be absolutely no wages paid for this backbreaking labor. He noted that the boy simply couldn't afford to pay anyone. Arthur laid out the uncompromising timeline, stating that Julian would have to work relentlessly from the beginning of October all the way through the end of March, and then he was to come back to the Brooks Ranch in the spring. Julian looked steadily at the older man, absorbing the immense weight of the grueling task being assigned to him, and bravely asked, "And if I do?" Arthur simply replied that then they would talk. This response was notably not a definitive yes to his request for courtship. It was certainly not a binding promise of marriage or future prosperity. However, Julian clearly understood exactly what it was meant to be. It was entirely the point of the whole exercise. Knowing this, Julian immediately said yes, agreeing to the brutal terms before Arthur had even fully finished speaking the sentence. Arthur silently noted this quick, decisive response, without visibly showing any outer sign that he had noted it. Martha, who was busy pretending to refill coffee cups that didn't actually need refilling, happily noted his quick acceptance too, and was considerably less subtle about hiding her pleased expression. Arthur, sticking to his stoic nature, deliberately chose not to look at his wife's triumphant face. Unbeknownst to the men negotiating in the kitchen, Hazel had quietly heard the entire intense conversation, while standing silently out in the nearby hallway. She had certainly not been formally invited to participate in this critical discussion regarding her own future, but she had stubbornly chosen to participate anyway, silently listening from a mere 6 feet away. And when Julian finally emerged from the kitchen, she was already standing there waiting by the front door. She wore a complex expression on her face that was equal parts deeply worried for his safety and incredibly proud of his bravery. She looked at him and said quietly, confirming the location, "The Thornton place." He solemnly replied, "Yes." She warned him gently, noting that it was notoriously hard land. "Up there." He nodded, acknowledging that he already knew the reputation of the place. She further emphasized the extreme danger, reminding him that old Silas Thornton had famously broken 2 strong ranch hands and a tough foreman over the past 10 years on that cursed land. Julian steadfastly replied that he fully knew that grim fact too. She stood there and looked deeply into his eyes for a quiet, emotional moment. Then, leaning in close, she spoke to him in a hushed voice that was purposefully kept low enough so that Arthur couldn't possibly overhear them from where he sat in the kitchen. She looked at him and simply commanded, "Come back in the spring." It was definitively not a romantic declaration of love. It was certainly not a formal promise of what awaited him upon his return. It was simply a firm direction, delivered flawlessly with the unwavering confidence of a strong woman who has already firmly decided exactly how things are going to go in the future, and is merely informing the relevant parties of the inevitable plan. Understanding perfectly, Julian firmly put his worn hat back on his head, walked purposefully out to his waiting horse, mounted up, and began the long ride north to face the coming winter. As he rode away, Martha Brooks stood quietly at her kitchen window, affectionately watching the young man go. She then spoke aloud, addressing no one in particular in the empty kitchen. She remarked with immense satisfaction that he had said yes before Arthur had even managed to finish his sentence. Arthur, standing silently behind her, said absolutely nothing in response, but, as Martha well knew, he was intently watching the young man right away too. Before we continue with the narrative, I want to take a brief moment to sincerely thank every single one of you for listening to the story up to this exact point, as your support truly means the world to us and allows us to keep producing these daily narratives. We greatly appreciate your time, and we would love to hear your thoughts down in the comment section below regarding what you believe is going to happen next to our young ranch hand as he faces the bitter cold of the impending winter season. Do you think he will successfully manage to save the entire herd and survive the brutal conditions? Or will the unforgiving frontier prove to be far too much for him to handle alone? Please leave a comment with your predictions, and if you are enjoying this type of immersive historical content, do not forget to officially subscribe to our growing channel, Wildwood Hearts, where we post new and engaging videos every single day for your entertainment. Now, returning to the rugged landscape of Wyoming in 1882, Julian Vance was about to deeply discover exactly what he was truly made of when pushed to his absolute physical and mental limits. The sprawling Thornton property was, exactly as Arthur Brooks had sternly advertised it to be, an incredibly hard and unforgiving piece of land. The expansive terrain was aggressively rocky and entirely exposed to the brutal elements, geographically positioned in such a vulnerable way that it caught absolutely every single freezing wind that violently came sweeping down from the distant Canadian border, with absolutely zero natural tree lines or sheltering hills to slow the biting gusts. The main wooden barn desperately needed extensive structural work to prevent the roof from fully caving in under the weight of the coming snow, and the large herd of cattle was currently in a severely poorly managed state, appearing dangerously thin and disorganized. Old Silas Thornton had certainly done his absolute best to maintain the massive property during his final years, but his physical capabilities and mental sharpness had been steadily and noticeably declining for quite some time before his death. Consequently, young Ethan Thornton, who was only 19 years old, incredibly earnest and completely and utterly overwhelmed by the monumental responsibility thrust upon his shoulders, greeted Julian Vance on the very first day of his arrival with the desperate, panicked expression of a drowning man who has just spotted a sturdy rescue rope. The young heir to the property was visibly exhausted, wearing a heavy coat that looked far too large for his thinning frame, and his hands trembled slightly from both the biting cold and the immense anxiety of facing the impending winter completely alone. He looked at the slightly older, more experienced ranch hand who had just ridden onto his failing property and immediately offered a stark, honest confession. He nervously stated, by way of a formal introduction, that he genuinely did not have any idea what he was doing when it came to managing the massive herd and securing the vulnerable property for the coming blizzards. Julian steadily tied his horse to the wooden rail, calmly looked at the distressed younger man standing in the freezing mud, and offered a simple, reassuring response. Julian stated that it was perfectly all right that Ethan did not know what he was doing, because Julian confidently knew exactly what needed to be done to ensure their mutual survival. What Julian Vance had certainly not anticipated or expected upon taking this grueling, unpaid assignment from Arthur Brooks was exactly how much the struggling young Ethan Thornton profoundly reminded him of his very own self when he was exactly 19 years old. This striking similarity was definitively not rooted in their wildly different financial circumstances or backgrounds, but rather it was found completely in the distinct quality of the young man's fundamental character and work ethic. Julian clearly recognized in Ethan the exact same humble willingness to openly admit exactly what he didn't currently know, without letting foolish pride endanger the critical operation. He saw the exact same fierce, unyielding determination to actually learn the difficult necessary skills, no matter how many exhausting hours of physical labor it required. Furthermore, he noticed the exact same pragmatic understanding that the harsh, frozen land absolutely did not care about your personal feelings, your grief over a lost father, or your physical exhaustion, and that the only viable response to that brutal indifference was to constantly pay close attention and simply keep working relentlessly until the necessary job was properly finished. Because of these shared fundamental traits, Julian quickly found himself teaching the younger man the complex mechanics of frontier ranching, with a deep, steady patience that he honestly did not even know he personally possessed. He did not do this vital instruction simply because it was strictly required of him by the terms of Arthur Brooks's harsh test, but rather because Ethan Thornton genuinely and completely deserved it. The grieving young man desperately deserved to have someone experienced who consistently showed up, who reliably stayed through the hardest parts of the day, and who crucially didn't make him feel stupid or inadequate for simply not knowing the intricate things that he had possessed absolutely no one to properly teach him after his father's sudden decline and passing. Through relentless daily instruction out in the freezing pastures, the crucial transfer of frontier knowledge began to take a solid, undeniable hold. By the time the bitter winds of November arrived in full force, Ethan had learned to accurately read the shifting, dangerous weather patterns well enough to proactively move the vulnerable cattle into the sheltered ravines long before a massive snowstorm actually hit the property. By the time the deep freezes of December locked the entire Wyoming landscape in ice, the young man fully understood the complex, demanding logistics of the daily feeding rotation, ensuring that the weakest animals received the essential nutrients required to survive the plunging nightly temperatures. And by the time the harsh, unforgiving month of January rolled around, Ethan was confidently and competently executing fully half of the required daily manual labor without ever needing to be explicitly directed or supervised by Julian. During these long, isolated winter months, Julian managed to write exactly 2 letters back to Hazel Brooks down in the lower valley. His letters were characteristically short, highly practical, and strictly focused on the tangible realities of the grueling work, detailing the specific condition of the Thornton herd, the state of the repaired fences, and the general depth of the snowdrifts. He sat by the dim light of a kerosene lantern in the drafty line shack, his fingers stiff from the cold, carefully writing out the plain facts of his daily existence because those were the only honest words he felt he had the absolute right to send to her under his current, impoverished circumstances. In stark contrast to his brief utilitarian updates, Hazel wrote him back substantially longer, deeply detailed letters that served as his only real tether to the world beyond the frozen Thornton boundaries. She eloquently and thoroughly described the sprawling Brooks Ranch as it sat quietly in the deep winter, painting vivid pictures with her words of the heavy, white snow slowly coming down the steep sides of the distant mountains. She recounted lengthy, amusing stories about what her mother, Martha, had recently said regarding some minor, local incident that successfully made both of them laugh heartily during the quiet evenings. As Julian carefully read the flowing ink on the pages, he could easily tell that she was deliberately and thoughtfully choosing every single word she committed to the paper. She was clearly writing to him in the specific intentional way that a person writes when they desperately want the distant reader to actually feel the profound essence of the thing they are describing, rather than just merely reading the cold, disconnected facts. She wanted him to feel the warmth of the Brooks kitchen, to hear the crackle of their fireplace, and to know that he was continuously and firmly held in her daily thoughts, despite the vast physical distance and the freezing miles that currently separated them. He quietly sat in the freezing, isolated cabin and read every single one of her precious letters exactly 4 separate times each, meticulously memorizing the shape of her handwriting and the rhythm of her sentences. He, of course, absolutely did not tell her that specific, vulnerable detail in his own brief, pragmatic replies. In the notoriously brutal month of February, the absolute worst and most violent snowstorm of the entire winter season came aggressively sweeping down from the Canadian border, turning the Wyoming sky into a blinding, chaotic expanse of churning white. The temperature rapidly plummeted to a dangerously low point, and Julian subsequently spent an agonizing 36 hours straight, relentlessly moving the panicked cattle through waist-deep snowdrifts, desperately trying to keep the massive animals from freezing to death where they stood. Alongside Ethan, he painstakingly worked to urgently fix a critical, collapsed section of the boundary fence using freezing tools and numb hands in temperatures that were so incredibly severe they instantly turned the moisture in a man's exhaled breath into solid crusts of ice against his woolen scarf. During this continuous, grueling, 36-hour battle against the lethal elements, Julian's experienced judgment and quick reflexes actively kept young Ethan from making 3 distinct, critical decisions that would have undoubtedly cost them the entirety of the winter herd. He forcefully stopped the exhausted boy from driving the cattle toward a false shelter that would have become a fatal snow trap. He redirected their feeding strategy when the wind shifted, and he physically pulled the younger man back from a snow-covered ditch that would have broken his legs. When the massive, relentless storm was finally over and the skies aggressively cleared to a cold, pale blue, Julian sat exhausted at the wooden table in the drafty Thornton kitchen. He sat there silently drinking the absolute worst, most bitter and poorly brewed cup of coffee he had ever tasted in his entire life, fully feeling the deep, agonizing ache in every single muscle of his overworked body. As he watched Ethan slump exhaustedly into the opposite chair, Julian thought, with a profound sense of solid certainty that this young boy was undeniably going to be completely all right going forward. And then, as the scalding, bitter coffee slowly warmed his freezing chest, he had a quiet, unexpected thought that struck him with profound clarity. He truly wanted to have a capable, resilient son exactly like this young man someday. And immediately after having that incredibly heavy domestic thought regarding a highly uncertain future, he purposefully forced himself to stop thinking altogether. He stood up from the wooden table, walked heavily to his small, freezing bunk in the back room, collapsed onto the thin mattress, and immediately fell into a deep, dreamless sleep. Meanwhile, down in the relatively more sheltered valley, Arthur Brooks absolutely did not sit idle or passive during that long, arduous winter. True to his calculating nature, he actively asked a multitude of specific questions. He did not do this obviously, or, aggressively, because Arthur Brooks fundamentally did not do anything in an obvious or easily predictable manner. Instead, with the highly deliberate, methodical patience of a serious man conducting a thorough, unannounced investigation into a matter of grave personal importance, he discreetly asked the neighboring Carmichael rancher about Julian's past work ethic. Carmichael openly and enthusiastically stated that Julian was undeniably the absolute best, most reliable ranch hand he had employed in the last 5 years, specifically noting that Julian was the only worker on the payroll who consistently fixed broken things without ever having to be asked twice. Arthur silently noted this highly favorable assessment. He then casually rode out to ask Silas Thornton's nearest neighbor, Elias Boone, exactly how the young Vance boy was actively managing the difficult situation up north on that cursed piece of land. Elias Boone reported that he had recently ridden past the Thornton property, back in December, and that the massive herd of cattle looked to be in substantially better shape than they had been in 3 full years. Elias further added that he had personally witnessed the young Thornton kid outworking the boundary fence line in brutal weather that would typically keep most grown men firmly inside by the fire, clearly indicating the strong, positive influence Julian was having on the boy. Arthur Brooks silently and carefully noted this critical piece of information too. True to form, he said absolutely nothing at all to his wife Martha about any of his discreet inquiries. Martha Brooks, however, who reliably possessed her own extensive network of local sources, already fully knew absolutely everything that her husband had quietly found out, along with several other key details that he hadn't yet uncovered. She also said absolutely nothing to him about her superior knowledge, primarily because 28 long years of successful marriage had thoroughly taught her exactly when it was appropriate to speak up, and exactly when it was far wiser to simply let a stubborn man arrive at the correct destination entirely on his own time. What Arthur was meticulously doing, even though he would have never actually described his actions in such sentimental terms, was actively building a solid, undeniable case, not against Julian Vance, but rather firmly for him. He was slowly and carefully assembling all the scattered evidence in the exact same methodical way he assembled absolutely everything else in his structured life, carefully, completely without rushing the process, and making absolutely sure that the underlying foundation of the structure would hold firm under intense pressure. Because Arthur Brooks fully understood something profound that young Julian did not yet comprehend. The grueling winter test was never actually about saving the Thornton property or the struggling herd. The true test was entirely about discovering exactly what a man chooses to do when there is absolutely no guarantee of a reward, when the final answer to his deepest request might still be a resounding no, when the daily physical work is agonizingly hard, when the brutal winter is endlessly long, and when absolutely nobody in the world owes him a single thing. The brutal test was fundamentally designed to reveal exactly what the young man's core character was truly made of beneath his worn clothes and polite manners. And Arthur, who fiercely prided himself on accurately reading the true nature of men, strongly thought that he already knew the positive answer, but he was stubbornly going to wait for the arrival of the spring season anyway, largely because he firmly believed that some difficult tasks simply need to be fully completed before their results can be officially confirmed, and partly because Martha had already told him 3 separate times that he was being entirely too stubborn, and he had defensively replied 3 separate times that he was simply being appropriately thorough, and in reality neither of them was entirely wrong in their respective assessments. Eventually, the brutal cold broke, and Julian rode his tired horse back to the sprawling Brooks Ranch on the 15th day of March. The heavy white snow was still visibly clinging to the high, jagged peaks of the distant mountains, but the lower valley was finally showing the very first, vibrant green signs of the arriving spring season. The familiar boundary creek that strictly divided the Carmichael and Brooks properties was once again running full, fast, and completely clear, looking exactly the way it had looked on the fateful morning he had fixed the broken wooden fence and met Hazel for the very first time. He possessed exactly $14 in his pocket when he had nervously left the valley back in October, and he possessed the exact same $14 when he finally returned in March. This was exactly as expected, because the grueling Thornton work had paid absolutely nothing in wages, which was the strict, uncompromising arrangement he had agreed to, and because he had spent the entire winter desperately keeping himself, young Ethan, and 60 head of vulnerable cattle alive rather than accumulating any personal material wealth. He was acutely and painfully aware of his meager $14 as he slowly rode up to the Brooks ranch anyway, ready to face whatever Arthur Brooks had decided. Arthur Brooks was sitting quietly on his expansive wooden porch, remaining perfectly still, looking for all the world as if he had not moved a single solitary inch since that fateful Thursday morning, back in the chilly month of October. The only discernible physical differences in the entire scene were that he was currently wearing a slightly lighter unbuttoned canvas jacket to appropriately accommodate the slowly warming spring air, and the towering Wyoming mountains located far behind his imposing silhouette were now displaying entirely different, vibrant colors as the heavy winter snow finally began to melt away. Julian slowly and methodically rode up to the sturdy perimeter fence, carefully tied his exhausted horse to the familiar wooden gate post, walked purposefully up the dirt path toward the heavy wooden porch, and stood nervously in the exact same spot where he had stood months prior. He looked up at the formidable older man, nervously cleared his dry throat, and respectfully said, "Mr. Brooks," waiting anxiously for any kind of verbal response. Arthur looked down at him in total uninterrupted silence for a very long, highly intimidating moment, letting the heavy, fragrant spring breeze fully fill the quiet space between them. Finally, the older rancher spoke in his trademark flat, unreadable tone, casually stating that his neighbor, Elias Boone, had recently informed him that the sprawling Thornton cattle herd had somehow managed to come through the brutal winter in substantially better physical shape than they had been in for several difficult years. He simply laid the established fact out there in the open air, neither overtly praising nor condemning the young man, just solidly establishing the undeniable reality of what had been successfully accomplished up north. Julian, remaining steadfastly humble and entirely unwilling to arrogantly brag about his own grueling, back-breaking efforts, immediately deflected the implied praise by simply and firmly replying that young Ethan had worked incredibly hard throughout the entirety of the harsh season. He further emphasized the grieving boy's immense effort by quickly adding that Ethan had learned the necessary, complex ranching skills surprisingly fast for someone suddenly thrust into such a desperate, unforgiving situation. Arthur completely ignored the modest deflection, choosing instead to press the issue further, and bluntly stated that Elias Boone had also specifically reported that Julian was the one who had physically fixed the damaged critical north fence line in the absolute middle of that horrific February snowstorm, working outside in freezing conditions for 36 consecutive hours. Julian looked down at his worn, mud-caked boots, feeling visibly uncomfortable with the direct, intense attention, and softly replied that the broken fence had simply needed fixing to save the herd, offering absolutely no further elaboration or dramatic complaint regarding his immense physical suffering. Arthur was completely quiet for another long, heavy moment, deliberately letting Julian's understated, humble response hang in the crisp spring air between them. He slowly leaned forward in his sturdy wooden chair, locked his piercing, fair-weather eyes directly onto Julian's exhausted face, and bluntly stated the harsh, undeniable reality of the current situation by pointing out that the young man still possessed absolutely nothing to his name. Julian, fully understanding the strict, uncompromising terms of the grueling arrangement they had made back in October, simply nodded his head in quiet agreement, respectfully replying, "Yes, sir," and honestly confirming aloud that he still had absolutely nothing of material value. Arthur did not flinch or look away, but instead immediately countered this stark admission by pointing out the highly significant, undeniable fact that despite having absolutely nothing, the young man was miraculously still standing right here on his porch. Julian once again nodded in silent agreement, quietly uttering another polite, "Yes, sir," as he stood his ground before the intimidating patriarch. Arthur Brooks sat silently and closely examined this earnest young man, taking in the full sight of a 22-year-old worker who was visibly worn thin and physically exhausted from enduring an incredibly hard, unforgiving winter. He saw a young man who still only possessed exactly $14 in his pocket and a tired horse tied to the fence, yet who was currently standing on his front porch with the unwavering, proud expression of someone who has successfully done exactly what was harshly asked of him. Arthur noted with deep, internal respect that Julian was absolutely not pretending the grueling ordeal had been easy. nor was he actively begging or asking for any special credit or unearned praise for simply doing the assigned work. In that quiet, decisive moment, Arthur felt something fundamental and profound suddenly shift deep inside his own chest, a rare positive emotion that he would have accurately described if forcefully pressed on the matter as a deep sense of immense paternal satisfaction. Finally, breaking the intense stare, Arthur gestured toward the heavy front door and gruffly instructed the young man to come inside the house. He added, almost casually, that his wife Martha currently had fresh coffee brewing on the stove, a domestic detail that severely contrasted with the heavy, life-altering tension of the moment. While it was not a formal, definitive yes to Julian's request for courtship, Julian correctly understood that it was absolutely the closest thing Arthur Brooks ever came to offering a positive affirmation before he was entirely, completely ready to do so. The hot, black coffee was exceptionally good, perfectly brewed to counter the lingering chill of the early spring morning, exactly as Julian remembered it. Martha Brooks's coffee was dependably and consistently excellent, a comforting domestic fact which Julian had gratefully noticed during his terrified visit back in October, and which he consciously noticed once again right now as he took his first desperate sip. He politely spoke up and directly complimented the warm beverage, stating his appreciation aloud, which instantly caused Martha to look at him with a very specific, deeply knowing expression. It was the exact same wise, maternal expression she had confidently been wearing ever since she first witnessed their initial conversation by the flooded fence line back in the month of May. It was the unmistakable look of a highly perceptive woman whose deeply held conclusions and romantic theories have been successfully confirmed repeatedly over time, and who is absolutely no longer surprised by any of the unfolding events in front of her. They all sat down together around the large, sturdy kitchen table, the formidable Arthur, the observant Martha, and the exhausted but hopeful Julian. A heavy, pregnant moment of silence slowly descended upon the warm kitchen, a complex silence that had several different unspoken thoughts, underlying tensions, and future implications heavily layered within it. Finally, Martha intentionally broke the quiet atmosphere by looking directly at Julian and casually asking if Hazel had been consistently corresponding with him throughout the long, dark winter months. Julian respectfully sat up straighter, replied, "Yes, ma'am," and honestly detailed the exact parameters of their long-distance communication. He openly confessed that Hazel had kindly written him 6 detailed letters, and that he had only written 4 brief letters back in response. He nervously explained his numerical discrepancy by humbly stating that he honestly hadn't known exactly how many responses would be considered socially appropriate, given his incredibly precarious, strictly tested standing with the family. Upon hearing this painfully honest explanation, Martha slowly turned her head and looked pointedly at Arthur, while Arthur deliberately avoided her gaze and instead looked incredibly closely at his dark coffee. With a tone of absolute, unshakable finality, Martha firmly stated that his 4 letters had been entirely appropriate under the difficult circumstances, effectively ending any potential debate on the strict rules of their courtship. Following Martha's definitive statement regarding the letters, another long, comfortable silence stretched across the warm kitchen, allowing the tension to slowly dissipate. Arthur eventually cleared his throat and steered the conversation back toward practical, serious ranching matters, specifically inquiring about the young Thornton boy, Ethan. He leaned forward on his elbows and sharply asked Julian exactly how the inexperienced boy was currently set up and prepared for the impending arrival of the next harsh winter season. Julian answered confidently and without hesitation, assuring the older man that Ethan would successfully manage the sprawling property going forward. He elaborated that the young boy finally knew exactly what he was doing out there on the frozen plains, having thoroughly learned the vital, unforgiving mechanics of frontier survival. However, Julian pragmatically added that Ethan might still need some physical assistance with that notoriously weak north boundary fence before the month of October rolled around again. He warned that that specific damaged section was almost certainly going to come down again under the immense pressure of the heavy autumn winds. But regarding the complex daily management of the massive cattle herd, Julian firmly asserted that the boy had the difficult situation completely under control. Arthur slowly nodded his head, carefully digesting the positive report, and pointedly stated that Ethan only had the situation under control because Julian had successfully taught him how to do it. Julian immediately deflected the praise yet again, stubbornly repeating that Ethan had simply learned incredibly fast and that the herd only survived because the boy had worked so relentlessly hard. Arthur stopped nodding, looked at Julian with an intense, penetrating stare, and bluntly pointed out that the young man consistently refused to take any personal credit for the positive things he successfully accomplished. Julian awkwardly looked down at the scratched wooden table, shifting uncomfortably under the intense scrutiny, and quietly mumbled that it simply didn't seem right or proper to loudly take credit for merely doing what needed to be done. Arthur Brooks absorbed Julian's humble response and remained completely quiet for an incredibly long, heavy amount of time. The stretching silence lasted long enough that Martha had ample opportunity to calmly stand up, walk around the large table, and carefully refill everyone's coffee cup with the absolute, unshakable serenity of a woman who knows exactly how this entire narrative ends, and who is simply patiently waiting for the very last page to finally turn. When Arthur finally spoke again, his voice lacked its usual gruff edge, carrying instead the rare, vulnerable weight of personal history. He looked at the young man and openly confessed that he had personally built this massive, successful ranch from absolutely nothing but dirt and determination. He slowly explained that exactly 28 years ago, he had been just a struggling young man who possessed nothing more than a horse, a worn saddle, his deep love for Martha, and approximately the exact same pitiful amount of money in his pocket that Julian currently possessed. Julian's head snapped up in surprise, his eyes wide as he actively listened to the formidable rancher reveal his own impoverished, difficult beginnings. Arthur continued his story, stating that Martha's strict, uncompromising father had firmly believed that Arthur was far too poor and entirely unsuitable for his precious daughter. Arthur paused, looked down at his dark coffee, and honestly admitted that the old man had been technically and entirely right in his harsh assessment. Arthur had indeed been completely destitute at the time. However, Arthur explained, his future father-in-law had given him one single grueling year to definitively prove otherwise through backbreaking, relentless labor. Arthur revealed that he had spent that entire, exhausting year working the old man's massive land for absolutely nothing, entirely without wages or any formal guarantee of success just to prove his worth. He paused significantly, letting the heavy parallel fully sink into the quiet room, and told Julian that he simply thought the young man should know that piece of personal history. The warm kitchen became incredibly quiet once again. Martha was silently looking out the window with the deeply emotional expression of a devoted woman who has been patiently waiting for 28 long years for her stubborn husband to finally tell that specific vulnerable story to the exact right person. Sitting at the table, Julian Vance finally understood everything with the sharp, breathtaking clarity of a young man receiving crucial information that instantly rearranges his entire worldview. He profoundly realized that this grueling winter test had never actually been Arthur's original, cruel idea at all. It had simply been the only meaningful, character-defining gift that Arthur Brooks actually knew how to give to another man. Arthur officially gave his final, highly anticipated answer later that same afternoon, though he certainly did not do it in a formal, emotional, or traditionally celebratory manner. Arthur Brooks fundamentally did not do anything in his life formally, or with unnecessary emotional decoration. Instead, he delivered his life-altering verdict in the exact same practical, understated way he delivered absolutely everything else, plainly, directly, and while he was actively busy doing something else entirely. They were both standing outside on the sturdy porch shortly after lunch, silently looking out over the sprawling, vibrant green valley, when Arthur casually broke the comfortable silence. He bluntly informed Julian that the young man was inevitably going to need to find steady, paying work for the upcoming summer season. He pragmatically suggested that the Carmichael operation would undoubtedly take him back, and calculated aloud that by the time the crisp fall weather arrived, Julian would surely have enough wages saved up to officially make a solid, respectable start in life. Julian turned his head and looked at the older man, carefully processing the practical advice, sensing that there was a deeper, unsaid offer hovering just beneath the surface of the words. Arthur kept his eyes locked on the distant horizon and continued speaking, noting with a critical eye that the expansive south pasture on his own property hadn't been properly or efficiently grazed by the herd in over 2 full years. He casually hypothesized that an intelligent, capable man, who truly knew what he was doing out there, could easily run 20 head of his own cattle on that specific pasture this coming season, without ever crowding or endangering the main Brooks herd. He paused, letting the immense weight of the massive opportunity hang in the spring air. He then firmly stated that this hypothetical, capable man would obviously need to formally negotiate strict business terms with him before any cattle were moved. Julian, his heart pounding in his chest, asked carefully what kind of terms the older man had in mind. Arthur looked at him and simply replied, "Fair ones." Julian instantly understood the profound magnitude of what was happening. He was not being given a free handout, but rather he was being offered a genuine, hard-earned start on fair, equitable terms. He knew this was the absolute right way to begin his life, and he firmly replied, "Yes, sir. I'd like that." Arthur nodded exactly once, accepting the deal, and then silently turned and walked back inside the house. Approximately 40 seconds after the heavy front door clicked shut behind Arthur, Hazel suddenly and eagerly appeared from around the far corner of the wooden house. Her quick appearance immediately confirmed that she had undoubtedly been silently standing there, closely listening to the entire crucial conversation taking place on the porch. Julian had strongly suspected she was hiding nearby the entire time, and confirming this suspicion made a wide, genuine smile break across his tired face, a deep expression of joy that he couldn't entirely control or suppress. She walked up to him, a bright, knowing look in her dark eyes, and playfully repeated his words, stating, "The South Pasture." He matched her tone, confirming the incredible deal by replying, 20 head. She stood close to him and looked up into his face with the exact same direct, confident expression she had worn while standing by the flooded boundary fence line all those months ago in May. She softly noted that her father had finally told Julian the old story about his strict father-in-law. Julian nodded, confirming that he had heard the tale, and Hazel smiled warmly, adding that her mother had predicted Arthur would eventually tell him whenever he felt the young man was truly ready to hear it. She paused, a soft laugh escaping her lips, and humorously added that Martha had been impatiently waiting for him to tell that story for 8 long months. Julian laughed aloud, and she laughed with him, their shared relief echoing across the empty yard. The beautiful, warming Wyoming spring seemed to fully hold them both in its vibrant embrace. The snow-capped mountains, the fresh green grass, and the rushing creek running clear between the properties all felt perfectly aligned. She would tell him many years later that he had written her exactly 6 letters during that terrible winter, and that she had meticulously counted each and every one, despite what he had told her mother. Standing there in the bright March sun, in the middle of the Brooks yard, he finally reached out and took her soft hand in his rough, calloused fingers for the very first time. She held onto his hand with the complete, effortless naturalness of something precious that has finally, irreversibly found its absolute, correct place in the vast world. He looked down at their joined hands and felt the need to humbly remind her that he currently still only possessed exactly $14 to his name. She looked back up at him, her dark eyes completely unafraid and entirely certain of their future, and calmly stated that she already knew that fact, but confidently assured him that he would certainly have much more money by the time September arrived. He nervously asked if September was truly enough time to prepare, and she replied with absolute, unyielding certainty that it was exactly enough time. They were officially and joyously married in the beautiful golden month of September in the year 1882, holding a modest but deeply emotional ceremony on a bright Saturday afternoon inside the small, local community church. Martha Brooks sat in the very front wooden pew and cried openly throughout the entire service, weeping with the profound, unashamed satisfaction of a highly perceptive woman whose deeply held romantic conclusions had been proven absolutely correct for the past 18 consecutive months. Arthur Brooks stood tall and rigid beside his emotional wife, stubbornly wearing the stoic expression of a tough, hardened man who was currently deeply moved by the beautiful ceremony, but would vastly prefer not to show a single ounce of vulnerable emotion to the gathered crowd. However, absolutely everyone in the small church could easily see through his tough exterior immediately, a fact which Arthur was fully aware of and had simply decided to endure with quiet, rigid dignity. Julian proudly wore his one good clean shirt and stood nervously at the wooden altar, watching his beautiful bride walk slowly down the aisle toward him. As she approached, his mind quickly flashed back to a broken fence in the muddy month of May, a terrifying conversation on a porch in October, and a brutal, isolated Wyoming winter that had felt, at times, incredibly dark and impossibly long. Yet looking at her now, he profoundly understood that every single agonizing, freezing day of that grueling test had been entirely and completely worth it to reach this exact beautiful moment. Hazel wore a stunning, simple cream-colored dress that her talented mother had painstakingly made by hand, with her dark, wavy hair properly and elegantly arranged for the special occasion. She walked steadily down the aisle with the absolute certainty of a strong woman who has known exactly where she was going in life for quite some time. Following the joyous wedding, they happily settled into their new life on the sprawling Brooks property during that first incredible year, honoring the South pasture arrangement he had made with Arthur. This initial, modest arrangement quickly and naturally expanded in the following spring to include a full working partnership regarding the cattle, an evolution that neither man had ever formally proposed aloud, but which both men had fully and silently understood was inevitably coming. Julian proved himself to be exactly the kind of reliable, hardworking man who proactively fixed broken things without ever having to be asked twice. Consequently, the entire massive Brooks ranching operation was running considerably smoother and was vastly better managed by the time the following spring season arrived. Arthur certainly noticed the massive improvements, and while he said absolutely nothing directly about it, he began subtly consulting Julian on major business decisions. He did this in a unique, roundabout way that was not quite explicitly asking for advice, but was certainly not quite ignoring his input either. Martha happily noticed this shifting dynamic between the two proud men and miraculously managed to say absolutely nothing about it, a feat which took considerable daily self-discipline. Their lives were forever and joyously changed when their very first child, a healthy, crying baby boy, arrived in the warm, sunny month of June in the year 1883. They proudly named their newborn son Ethan. When Martha first heard the chosen name, she looked deeply into Julian's eyes, said absolutely nothing aloud, but let her warm, tear-filled expression silently communicate everything that needed to be said regarding his beautiful, honorable choice. Arthur, however, spoke up, gruffly seeking confirmation, and asked if they had truly named the boy Ethan, after the young Thornton boy from up north. Julian simply and honestly replied that the hard-working young man had endured a lot and truly deserved to have something meaningful named after him. Arthur was quiet for a long, contemplative moment, chewing on the profound gesture, before simply stating, "Good name." Little Ethan came into the wide frontier world, inheriting his father's dark, thick, curly hair, and possessing his mother's incredibly direct, unwavering gaze. And from the very first, momentous time that Arthur Brooks awkwardly held his new grandson, standing awkwardly in the doorway of the bedroom with the small, fragile baby cradled in his massive, calloused arms, a profound shift occurred. As Arthur looked down at this tiny new person who had forcefully arrived into their lives with the particular, undeniable authority of someone who fully intends to be here, something incredible happened to the older man's hardened face. It was a rare, vulnerable expression that Martha had only witnessed a small handful of times in their 28 years of marriage. The tough, uncompromising rancher completely and utterly went soft. It was not a highly visible or dramatic physical collapse, but Martha's trained eye clearly saw the specific, profound softening of a strong man who has forcefully carried the heavy weight of the world for a very long time, and who has suddenly found, in the surprisingly light weight of a sleeping child in his arms, something pure that absolutely does not require him to be endlessly strong. Arthur held little Ethan for a very long time, entirely without speaking a single word. Finally, he slowly lifted his head, looked directly at Julian, who was standing quietly near the bedroom window watching the tender scene unfold, and softly said, "Good boy." Julian smiled, fully understanding in his heart that the older man was absolutely not talking about the baby. On a particularly warm and beautiful Sunday afternoon, later that same idyllic summer, the sprawling Brooks property was completely full of life and joy in a way that it had absolutely not been full since Hazel herself was a small, Running child. Arthur was happily sitting out on the sturdy front porch with little Ethan bouncing gently on his knee, speaking softly to the tiny infant with the intense, focused seriousness of an older man who has firmly decided that this small person entirely deserves real, meaningful conversation. Martha was standing peacefully in the open doorway, affectionately watching her family with the exact same deeply satisfied, knowing expression she had confidently worn since that fateful day in May of the previous year. Out in the grassy yard, Julian and Hazel were working together, their quiet laughter drifting on the breeze. The towering Wyoming mountains were silently doing what they always beautifully did in the background, anchoring the vast landscape. The familiar Boundary Creek was running fast and clear between the lush properties, and Arthur Brooks, the formidable man who had mercilessly tested a desperate young hand with a brutal winter, 14 meager dollars, and absolutely no promises, sat on his porch with his beloved grandson, entirely satisfied with how things had turned out. Arthur had deliberately given Julian Vance the absolute hardest, most grueling winter of his entire life. He had offered absolutely no wages, no safety guarantee, and no promise whatsoever that a yes to his marriage request was actually waiting for him at the bitter end of the suffering. He had offered just the raw, brutal work itself. It was just a harsh test to answer the ultimate question of exactly what a man chooses to do when nobody owes him anything. And Julian, a 22-year-old kid with just $14 and a worn shirt, had bravely said yes before Arthur had even finished speaking the terrifying sentence. That split second is the exact moment that truly matters in this entire story. It was not the beautiful wedding, nor the lucrative South Pasture deal, nor even the emotional spring afternoon when Arthur finally shared his own father-in-law's story. The exact moment that mattered most was that tiny, courageous fraction of a second between the grim end of Arthur's harsh offer and the immediate beginning of Julian's unwavering answer. It was the profound moment when a young man with absolutely nothing looked directly at a brutal, unrewarded winter and bravely said yes anyway, simply because that is exactly what true, undeniable character looks like long before it has any money or success to prove itself with. Arthur knew this, having lived it himself, giving Julian the greatest gift of all. Not an easy path, but the hard-earned chance to truly show what he was made of. The richest, most valuable thing Julian brought to the Brooks family was not the cattle or the labor. It was the pure, resilient character he displayed in the freezing dark when nobody was watching, proving that some people show up completely from the very beginning, and the rest is just time. If you made it all the way to the end of this incredible story, thank you from the absolute bottom of my heart. Looking back on Julian's journey, the positive message we can all carry forward is that true character is forged and revealed not when the spotlight is on us or when the reward is guaranteed, but during the dark, freezing winters of our lives when nobody is watching and nothing is promised. Doing the hard, honest work, simply because it is the right thing to do, will eventually carve out a solid place for you in this world. If this tale of resilience and earning one's place resonated with you today, please do not forget to subscribe to our channel for more stories just like this one.